I've started to realize recently is that when it comes to the COVID situation, I have implicitly, subconsciously, maybe, probably not, probably more conscious, but made some decisions about how I feel about the situation. And by that I mean like the protocols that I practice in terms of what's recommended and what I actually do. And the realization is which is relatively straightforward. Like I seem to be leaning more towards, I'm not as concerned about it as at least the mainstream media or the general guidance would suggest we should. I just lean more towards believing that it's a risk, but it's not as grave of a risk as we're being told. And as I say that, I recognize and fully acknowledge and entertain the possibility that I could be wrong. I'm just being honest and truthful about where I come out on the assessment of it right now. So as new information comes in, I'm constantly assessing that. I'm constantly challenging my thinking to make sure that I'm thinking of it right. And don't get me wrong, there are plenty of protocols that I do follow, right? If I go out in public, I'm always wearing a mask, as is my family, my son, etc. I try to limit interactions at big gatherings. I haven't been going to, training or the gym or anything like that, in groups. And just generally trying to practice the good social distancing and all that, the quarantine kind of guidelines. But there's times where I go astray a bit, right? At family gatherings, maybe get closer than we should, not always wearing masks, if we're not socially distancing. I've seen some friends at barbecues, outside type stuff, but probably technically according to the rules, we should have had masks on the whole time. So different things like that. And what that makes me do, as I just said, is like as I've started to make those decisions and I get more comfortable and more grounded in them, I want to challenge them. I don't want to let the roots take full grab and get to certainty ultimately, right? I want to remain that healthy level of doubt and questioning and challenging what seems to be somewhat of a right or obvious choice. So that's what I'm trying to do, really. And I think the first step in that is understanding, as we've talked about in the past, like what's the calculation you ran to get to the first decision, to say like, hey, I believe it's serious. I'm going to do a lot of the stuff, but not all of it. I think it's, the risk maybe isn't as great as I'm being told. How do you get to that calculation? And I hope you would trust that when I say this, I'm trying to practice what I preach, that I try and take in all the information and all the perspectives as best I can, right? Understanding that's never going to be perfect, and I have biases and blind spots, but as best I can, I try and look at it objectively and looking at all the different factors of, the risks, the impact on other people, and how other people can get sick as a result of our decisions. I try and be realistic about the timing of it. And, if it's just going to be for 6 months or a year, don't get over dramatic about that. I try and be realistic about the science as I've understood it, that there are unique factors of this virus that make it difficult to understand, how it impacts different people, how it spreads always, perhaps it's mutated in some ways. I take all those things in, and I take in all those inputs. And I take in the other side. I take in the impacts that it's having on the economy of being quarantined. I take in the impact it's having on people's mental health and well-being. I try and take in the risks to our liberties and freedoms, just realistically. Not saying wearing a mask is all of a sudden means, we've lost all our freedoms, but there is some truth to it, right? Slippery slope is a phrase for a reason. There should be a healthy questioning anytime your liberties or freedoms are taken away. There should be a high threshold. So it's not to say it's not justified, but you should make sure. So I try and take all that in and consider that piece of it. And, just also the science and the data. I try and take in the other side of it. What is actually the mortality rate? What is actually the risk of this? Trying to, again, just look at it objectively. So I take all that in. And as I think about it, the things that have led me to err more on the side of being a little more comfortable taking risks, not thinking it's the most dangerous thing right now and that I need to completely uproot my lifestyle because of it. The things that lead me to that are, a few things. One is the lack of credibility I have about all the information that's coming in. Now let me explain that a little bit. It's not that I believe it's false or that it's wrong. As you know, I rarely have any certainty in anything that's 100% true or 100% false. There's some gauge, there's some assessment on a spectrum of how valid and valuable I think a piece of information is. And for some information that's coming in, which would seem to be obvious, right? There's certain information I think people take when they are on the side of you need to do every single thing we're being told, like lock down as much as possible. For example, one of the things they would lock in on is the number of deaths, naturally. 150, almost 160,000 deaths, I think, now in the US. A lot of people point to that, and it's kind of a mic drop. It's like, why are we even talking about this? Why are we even debating if we should be following all the protocols and how dangerous this is? Like 150,000 plus Americans died because of it. And again, as I said earlier, I take that in and I feel that and I understand that and the gravity of that. But as with everything, I want to understand its truth. I want to understand it objectively, not subjectively. So when you say something like that, 150, let's call it 155,000 people dead, since February or March, that's significant. That means something. That should matter. That should impact the way you think. But you also have to take that in its full context, right? 150,000 people have died, 155,000, let's call it. Horrific, terrible thing. You've heard the obvious claims of, well, how many people die from the flu? How many people die? And that's, although it doesn't prove that the coronavirus or COVID isn't serious, they're reasonable questions to ask, right? Because if what we're saying when we say 155,000 people died, enough said, what we're saying is that creates the cost-benefit analysis to determine what we should do. That's the thing that's driving a lot of the part of it saying we need to lock down. 155,000 people died. Like that's the value, that's the argument. So you question that argument. You need to understand it fully. If that's one of the most important tenets of it, you want to truly understand that. And when I say you need the context of it, it does matter, right? So it's been, March, April, May, June, July, 5-6 months, whatever it is we're going on in the COVID situation. I want to know some of the specifics around that number, right? Obviously, one of them is how certain are we that those were all truly COVID deaths? It's just a question, right? It's a fair question to ask. If we have a high confidence that it's 155,000 or at least very close to it, okay, then we have our answer, but it's a fair question to ask, right? There is some debate about that potentially and just the accuracy of the testing and other things and how you're counting a COVID death if you have other ailments as well. So that's a fair question to ask. There's also fair questions to ask of how does that stack up against other things, right? How many people have died from cancer or drug overdoses or gun violence or drunk driving or, pick the other heart disease, pick the different things during that similar time period, because that matters. If 155,000 people died from coronavirus during that time period, but I'm making this up, but let's just say during that same time period, 300,000 people died from opioid overdoses. And let's say 400,000 people died from boating accidents. Let's make it up, right? Let's just, whatever it is, that would matter. Because if that's such an important determinant, that's what we're trying to eliminate, 155,000 deaths in that time period is unacceptable, then we need to be consistent in how we apply that to anything else. And if the opioid crisis is producing more deaths, we need to figure out, hey, if that's what's important, then we need to stop that. And arguably, we need to stop that first because there's more people dying. If that's the gauge, people dying, we need to understand the benchmark and how it sits contextually. That all matters. That's all relevant. And one of the things that I'm particularly curious about, and I've honestly struggled to find it, which helps me put that into perspective better, is if we look at the number of people that have died from all different common, causes or whatever they are, over the time period of February to August. We look at it this year and we see those numbers and we see how many are COVID related and how many are cancer or heart disease or opioid overdose or boating accident. Let's look over the last 5 years and see, is there a trend there? Do we see that there's less people seemingly dying from other things and that's now being shifted to COVID? So is it ultimately the same amount of deaths, which any death is horrible, but if you're losing the same amount of people, then it shouldn't change the actions you take. It shouldn't change the way that you interact as a society. Now, maybe it's not. Maybe we're not seeing that trend. My point in asking this question, which is often misconstrued, is that I'm trying to prove that COVID isn't that serious. What I'm trying to prove is the truth. That's my goal. I don't care what the truth is, but I want to know what it is. So these questions are meant to get there. Just like I wouldn't blindly accept that 155,000 people means we definitely need to take these actions without understanding all this context. I wouldn't just accept that. I need to know that context. I also wouldn't go the other way and say, there's no way you're ever going to convince me that any virus, requires us to lock down and shut down the economy and not allow people to work and build up trillions of dollars of debt and force people to wear masks. It's very possible that's all necessary, and I'm totally open to that. But I want to know as close as I can that it's the objective truth. I don't want to just blindly follow bits and pieces of information. So I'm looking at things like that. And the problem with that type of scenario, when you look at that type of information, where it's one of the key metrics that tells you how should we act, right? Deaths, the total spread of the virus, those types of things. But let's talk about death because that's what we're on. Then I look at how it's being presented to me. And I say, are the people that are telling me we need to take these actions, are they presenting that information to me in good faith? Are they presenting it to me in a way in which acknowledges that context matters and the reference of where it sits in terms of other, issues matters? And are they shooting it to me in a way that feels legitimate and straight so that their objective is also objective truth, right? Because if that's their objective, they would naturally be asking these questions as well and be putting that information out there. Almost to say like, hey, you may be unsure because just the stat of 155,000 dead may leave a lot of questions. So let me answer those questions for you and let those questions, the answers to those questions fall where they may. If it ultimately leads to a point of, hey, this isn't as serious as we thought, we don't need to be as restrictive as we thought, well, if that's the truth, then great, that's what we're gonna do. But when it's positioned in a way where it doesn't even ask those questions, it seemingly doesn't give people a chance to understand the full context, well, then I have a problem, right? Now, again, it doesn't mean I blindly go the other way and say it's definitely a conspiracy, definitely this whole COVID thing is nonsense, forget everything. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is it interjects doubt. It interjects making me believe, hey, I can't be sure now about this information. And if I can't get straight answers to these questions, and I can't get it to be presented to me in a straight way, well, now that matters in how I make my decisions. It changes the way I think about it. I can't just accept that it's as bad as it is. And it's hard for me to trust the sources it's coming in from, right? It would seem very logical to put that information in a headline, to say, we've lost 155,000 people now. Let me put that into perspective into how many people we lost for the 6-month period last year and the year before, and how it looks, based on other diseases and other things that killed people. It would make a lot of sense to show it that way, because if the truth is COVID is as dangerous as you believe it is, then let the truth speak for itself, right? Let that come out. The only reason you would want to hide that information is if maybe it's not as clear. And this gets to a principle we've talked about of sacrificing truth for simplicity. And that's kind of what I see happening here. I see people who I think might mean well, some cases they don't, but they believe as though there's a risk here. And they're willing to sacrifice some of the truth, not giving all the full objective contextual information around it, because they're so sure that they're on the side of truth, right? That they're on the right side. So we can sacrifice a little bit of it just to make it simple so that everybody just does what we need them to do, because we genuinely believe that's the better way to go. So it doesn't even have to be that people are being malicious, but that approach interjects doubt, and it messes with that cost-benefit analysis. And for somebody like me, it makes me say, well, if I can't be sure, right, of how risky this actually is, and that's just one example of the number of deaths. You could also look at something else like what the plan and the approach has been throughout this, right? It's possible there's good faith, scientifically driven reasons as to why it went from, hey, most people saying it's not a huge deal, we don't have to wear masks, to, hey, we need to shut down the world and the country for 2 weeks, and then 4 weeks, and then another month, and then it goes on, and then it was we're just trying to flatten the curve. Now it appears to be more we're trying to eliminate the virus altogether, and then we just have to wait till the vaccine, but then it's, well, the vaccine may not cover everybody, and it may not work, and if everybody doesn't take it, we may still have risk. So I look at all this, and again, I don't say it to assume or imply that there's manipulation happening. I say it to say, you look at that fact pattern, and it's possible. That's what it would look like if manipulation were happening. So just like with the number of deaths, I need to understand the context. You need to give me all the information around this. Why are those decisions changing? What actually is the plan now? Is it realistic to assume we're not going to have any deaths from COVID, or that they should be minuscule? Or like most diseases, is it reasonable to expect some number of deaths? As uncomfortable and awkward and cold as that sounds, but we do it in all other aspects of life and with other situations like cancer, like opioid overdoses, like all these things. So it's another situation where I take in the information. I don't know for sure that it's conspiracy or manipulation, just like I don't know for sure that it's all legitimate. And the reason we kept changing, the endpoint and the guide and the the goalpost of where we're going, maybe there's good reason for that, but it's not clear to me. And if it's not clear to me, then I can't act on that information with complete certainty or in any way like that. So my goal is to try and get that clarity, to try and understand why it's been moved and is it being presented in a fair way. And again, if I'm not clear on that, this is kind of where I start to get to. And for me in particular, as I'm not clear on it and I think about the severity of how it's impacting my life and my family's life, and not being able to hug your own mother and father, not being able to see your cousins, truly play together and spend holidays together, that matters too, right? And again, if all of that was being given up, among other things like the economy and people's well-being and their livelihood and their jobs, right? You can go on with the list of things people have sacrificed for COVID. If all of that was being given up and you were sure that it was, or as close to sure as you could be, that it's for a good reason, okay, that's a decision I could make. But if, like I said about the deaths, like I said about the plan and how the end point is moved, if there's too much doubt in there, I personally can't see a scenario where I sacrifice that much, we sacrifice that much when we're not sure, right? So we need to get more certainty if that's ultimately what we want to do. Now, that's just my take on it. But I think a big part of it is trying to address those points, right? If you're acting in good faith, if you genuinely just care about the truth, you would be honest, you would be open, you would acknowledge, you would give full context. You wouldn't feel the need to sacrifice truth for simplicity. And for me, that just pushes me into a direction of, it's a cost-benefit analysis. And the cost of what's being given up to protect against COVID, I'm willing to do some of it, right? I'm willing to take in some of that cost. I'm willing to wear the mask. I'm willing to distance. I'm willing to not go to the gym. I'm willing, if we have to not let my son go to school. But it only goes so far until you show me how the benefits are so clear, how we're preventing deaths, how the deaths we're preventing mean as much, right? Is it just being shifted from cancer to COVID? All the stuff we talked about. I need to know. I need to know the answers to that. And short of it, I just have to make the best cost-benefit analysis I can, and that's kind of where I come out at it. I constantly challenge it. I constantly question it. I'm constantly looking to bring in new information. But that's just the way I've thought through that.